Thank you very much for the invitation, Dan. It's an honour to be invited to be involved in this. I'm Dr. Sophie Killer and I'm a performance nutritionist. As Dan said, I work with elite athletes, Olympic, Paralympic athletes and professional athletes. And I'm also, I hold a research fellowship, so I'm actively engaged in research. Today, Dan has given me the task of discussing endurance nutrition in 20 minutes, which is no small feat. So I'm going to whistle through an update on performance nutrition in endurance as quickly as I possibly can. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so the evolving world of sports nutrition for the endurance athlete. Well, we certainly have come a long way in the last 70 or so years, going back all the way to the 50s, where the guidelines would be very much to limit the amount of nutrition or specifically hydration that endurance athletes should be having. I'm not even going to comment on this photograph from a pro cycling event where it looks like the athletes are sharing a cigarette, but at least they did have some bottles of fluids on the front of their bike, although who knows what was in those. Certainly the scientific developments have enabled really evidence-based performance nutrition, which has had a big impact in the field of sports sciences. And what I'm going to talk about today is specifically how our understanding of carbohydrate metabolism has impacted our knowledge and application of nutrition in endurance sports. I'm going to share with you some new insights from track and field, some research that I've been really lucky enough to be involved in, and then a brief talk about what might be next in the field of nutrition for endurance sports. So cast your mind back to the late 70s, where the Bergstrom muscle biopsy technique was first utilised in this field of science to really start to understand what was happening in the muscle during exercise. And this was amazing because it provided that insight, that first insight into glycogen depletion during exercise. And really for the first time, we understood that low muscle glycogen was associated with exercise-induced fatigue. And this really opened those possibilities for us to start playing around with performance nutrition strategies to make sure that athletes were exercising with full glycogen stores at the onset of exercise, and possibly how we could try and maintain those glycogen stores throughout that endurance exercise. So if we have an overview of carbohydrate flux throughout an exercise session, here at the beginning we have our pre-exercise carbohydrate stores always as high as possible before starting an endurance event. So can we manipulate this? Can we make this higher? Can we influence the utilization of how we burn carbohydrate or glycogen during exercise? And can we speed up the rate of recovery? And carbohydrate can have an influence in each of these different aspects of performance nutrition, of exercise. So yes, there's a wealth of science that shows us how we can maintain and get high glycogen stores through carbohydrate diets. So a kind of 3 to 6 gram per kilo diet of carbohydrate would be recommended for moderate training needs, and we can start to push that higher for our endurance athletes, perhaps 6 grams per kilo upwards, perhaps 10, 12 grams per kilo for some ultra endurance athletes. There's some evidence that you can do carbohydrate loading strategies, looking at supercompensation with a glycogen depleting exercise, maybe a 3-minute all-out glycogen depleting exercise at the beginning of a carbohydrate load to try and push those glycogen stores up even higher. And then, of course, there's loads of research looking at different tapering strategies, how we can reduce our exercise leading into a competition, maybe 24, 48 hours, perhaps even longer, whilst maintaining a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, and how that can really push up glycogen stores pre-exercise. Can we speed up the rate of recovery? Again, there's been some fantastic research over the last 20, 30, 40 years looking at how we can restore muscle glycogen and protein and enhance protein synthesis as quickly as possible and as best as possible after exercise with different feeding strategies. And it's generally understood that a reasonably high carbohydrate intake in those immediate hours post-exercise, particularly a high glycemic index carbohydrate, can really speed up that rate of recovery of muscle glycogen. And there's some brilliant research from Stu Phillips' lab looking at protein and how we can optimize protein recovery and really optimize protein synthesis after exercise, specifically looking at how we periodize protein throughout the day, and that it's better to have reasonably large amounts, say 4, possibly more times across the day to maintain that positive protein balance, as opposed to 1 or 2 really large boluses of protein or lots of small amounts of protein throughout the day. And certainly if our recovery period is less than 6 to 8 hours because the athlete's training twice a day, or perhaps they're in a tournament with heats and rounds, then that recovery and nutrition becomes even more important. And can we influence the rate of utilization of carbohydrate during exercise? Yes, and I'm going to come on to some really exciting research here. So this concept of multiple transport carbohydrates came around in the early 2000s from some amazing research from Professor Asker Ukendroop's lab. This was the first time we'd really started to learn that the rate of carbohydrate absorption was limited at the intestinal lining. And here you can see glucose passing through from the stomach into the bloodstream through a glucose transporter that's supported by sodium. And you can see here glucose is moving freely. But if we start to consume large amounts of glucose, so roughly above around 60 grams per hour, you can now see that sugar, those glucose molecules, are starting to build up in the stomach and not able to transport through and be oxidized in the blood where we can use it as a fuel. And this is a problem because not only are we consuming carbohydrate that we're not able to use, so it's a waste, but also it can cause gastrointestinal discomfort if we now have this buildup of carbohydrate in the stomach. So what was really novel about this research is that when you combine fructose with glucose with a different type of sugar, so here fructose, you can now see that sugar molecule is being transported through a different receptor. And now we're able to get glucose across the membrane, and we're also able to get more carbohydrate through a different source, so multiple transport of different sugars from the food that we're consuming into the bloodstream. And what was really novel about this was for the first time it showed that we could have oxidation rates of exogenous carbohydrates, so carbohydrate that we're consuming during exercise, above that kind of threshold of around 60 grams per minute. And now being able to push that even higher to some more like 90 and above. And that would enable more carbohydrate consumption by an athlete, and perhaps greater performance. Following this study, there was a wealth of studies that came out of that laboratory in Birmingham under the supervision of Asker Ukendroop and led to the eventual publication of this paper, A Step Towards Personalised Sports Nutrition, specifically looking at carbohydrate intake during exercise, where they say a single source of carbohydrate can be oxidized at rates of around 60 grams per hour. And this is recommended for endurance exercise lasting a couple of hours. But for those ultra endurance events, so those long distance cycling events, ultra triathlons, Ironman, long distance running, it's actually recommended that higher intakes, more like 90 grams plus per hour, are recommended. And carbohydrate ingested at such high ingestion rates must be from these multiple transport carbohydrates to allow that high oxidation rate and prevent an accumulation of carbohydrate in the intestine, where it's likely to cause gastrointestinal discomfort. So this was really, really groundbreaking and really positive step forward in terms of performance nutrition for endurance exercise. Following this, a little bit later on in 2018, came a really brilliant paper from Sam Impey, who was doing his PhD under the supervision of James Morton at Liverpool John Moores. This paper, Fuel for the Work Required, proposed a really nice scientific framework about how you can periodize carbohydrate intake. And there's an example here taken from their paper. So for the first time, this provided the scientific evidence of periodizing carbohydrate across a microcycle, so across the course of a day, across the course of a week, as opposed to a longer term macrocycle where you might look at altering carbohydrate based on training needs, whether that's away at a training camp, trying to maybe lose some body fat. We could now start to zoom in, and this really supported what practitioners were doing in terms of adjusting carbohydrate intake kind of meal by meal, day by day to support those individual training sessions. So now we could really have that evidence to support that applied practice of providing advice to athletes specifically around carbohydrate intakes. And I like to think that all of this research has led to these amazing feats. So in 2019, Eliud Kipchoge was the first person to run a sub 2 hour marathon. And I didn't have the pleasure of being involved in it, but I've been lucky enough to listen to Professor Andrew Jones, who was involved, about all of those key aspects that enabled this amazing feat of endurance. So the careful planning with the environmental conditions, looking at the weather, the humidity, the altitude, making sure it was all optimal for maximal running speed, the pacing strategies that we used, the technology with those amazing Nike shoes, the athlete physiology, but of course, and most importantly for us, the nutrition strategies that were involved and the intricate planning. So instead of feed stations for the athletes to pick up their drinks, they delivered the nutrition via a bike so that they could really prevent the athlete from needing to slow down. Bespoke drinks were provided based on those individual needs using scientific data that we have learnt over the years to really optimize carbohydrate delivery. So optimizing the volume of carbohydrate and the concentration of those solutions, and provided every 7 minutes. Of course, through the bike instead of the feed stations, making sure pre-race glycogen stores were optimal, and using 2 key supplements, according to Andy. Again, this is information, secondary information, having not been there myself, but using supplements like caffeine and nitrates to really enhance that performance. So I can see how nutrition can play a really, really important role in endurance events like this. Where else can we get our impact from nutrition and endurance? Well, for me, trackside testing is where the magic of performance nutrition really happens. So these continual advances in technology are enabling this further understanding of individual responses of elite athletes. We're not just going to the literature, reading the scientific publications that have actually been collected on data really from a general population, and more often than not from university students. We're now able to use these small point-of-care devices and actually collect data from our elite athletes in the field where it's actually happening. And this enables some real life insights, as opposed to laboratory insights, which we then have to extrapolate to the impact that might have in the field. And these small devices are actually able to measure lots of different blood biomarkers, for example, lactate and bicarbonate, where we can then really start to design bespoke supplement strategies for sodium bicarbonate, oxidative stress markers, looking at training load and how we can potentially use these devices to prevent overreaching and overtraining, and even small devices that might be able to assess glycogen stores. So we're really lucky that the science has come this far that is enabling us to gather this kind of real-time data. And what about real-time sweat data? Could that be the next step for us? Companies like Flow Biotechnologies are now designing these really small, smart sweat patches that athletes can wear. So they're non-invasive, providing real-time hydration data. And I know Ian Rollo is going to talk more about hydration, so I won't talk about this too much, but this is something that's quite exciting for me, I think. Now we can perhaps get real-time information on sweat rate, electrolyte losses, perhaps on osmolality, and really question mark, what else is it that we could be looking at? And I think it's for us as applied practitioners and researchers to really think about what might be beneficial in terms of athlete health and athlete performance. And if we can get this information in real time, live time, could that have a really could that be really beneficial for endurance events if it's linked to your watch and it can give you this live feedback? So it's exciting for me to think about how we could use this data with endurance athletes to enhance performance and recovery. So I want to share with you a new insight from track and field, some work that we've been doing in British athletics. And it all kind of came about because I started to notice that we were seeing a reasonably high prevalence of magnesium deficiency in our track and field athletes. And I couldn't really get my head around this, because even if you're a vegan athlete, you're still able to consume plenty of magnesium in the diet. So I set about to do some initial research to compare magnesium intakes in the diet with magnesium status in our track and field athletes compared to a normal general population, in a collaboration with the University of Surrey. And what we found was that both the athletes and the non-athletes were consuming plenty of magnesium, but our athletes did have a significantly lower magnesium status than non-athletes. So it's kind of intrigued me even further. So we then went on to do a study to look at what was happening to magnesium during exercise. We wanted to specifically look at magnesium losses, and unfortunately we weren't able to do muscle biopsies and look at biochemistry, but we could look at sweat data and we could look at changes in plasma magnesium. And what we found was that plasma magnesium would decline during exercise and then return post-exercise, transiently within a few hours. So what we thought was, if we were to preload magnesium before exercise, could that help stabilize those fluctuations in magnesium? And we did find that that would happen. But whether this is important, whether this has an impact on long-term magnesium deficiency, we don't know. By this point, I'd sparked the interest of the doctors at British Athletics, and we decided to do a big project together where we did a big deep dive into 8 years worth of medical data that we had on our Olympic and Paralympic athletes. Our aim was to understand if there were any associations between gender, ethnicity, athletic discipline, or clinical history of bone stress, muscle injuries, the number of muscle injuries per year, within the year of the blood test, or tendon pain, which was diagnosed as an Achilles or patella tendon pain that lasted longer than 3 months of chronic pain. And we recently published this paper if anyone is interested in having a read. So we had over 500 samples from just under 200 Olympic and Paralympic athletes collected over this 8-year period, analysed for red cell magnesium status. I mentioned the associations we were particularly interested in looking at. We noted that a significant number of athletes did have magnesium deficiency, which was clinically defined as a red cell magnesium less than 1.9 millimoles per litre. What we found was that on at least one blood test during the study, 22% of athletes were identified as being clinically deficient in magnesium. We found that magnesium was significantly lower in female athletes compared to male athletes. It was lower in athletes with black or mixed race ethnicity. It was higher in our throws athletes, and it was also higher in our Paralympians with cerebral palsy. In terms of the clinical outcomes, we found that athletes that had a history of Achilles or patellar tendon pain had significantly lower red cell magnesium than average. And what's interesting is that magnesium is involved in the propagation of pain. And actually, there is some clinical research that suggests that there really could be a link here, and that's something that's really interesting for us. We found that every muscle injury was associated with a lower red cell magnesium status. But interestingly, we didn't find any correlations with bone stress injuries, which was surprising for me because magnesium is so closely linked in its metabolism to calcium and vitamin D. But in our cohort, we had relatively low numbers of bone stress injuries. So I think perhaps we were underpowered here, and it's something I'd like to look into further. So we proposed some new guidelines and future directions for magnesium research. We believe it should be an important part of screening for endurance athletes. Currently, from communications I've had across my network, it doesn't seem to be an analyte that's regularly measured in blood screening. We think it probably should start to be included. We proposed some specific guidelines for optimal status for elite athletes, whereas before we just had clinical guidelines. So based on our research, we've proposed these. And we think really that a lot more research is needed to understand the prevalence of magnesium deficiency across other sports, the importance of magnesium for elite athletes and the risk of inadequate stores, and how maybe fluctuations in plasma status across the course of a training session, how that, why that happens and whether that's actually important. Perhaps it doesn't matter if it's returning, within a couple of hours post-exercise, or whether that might contribute to magnesium deficiencies. So my final thoughts are that the collaborations between the scientists and the applied practitioners, and the more people that are able to do both, is really key to the future of performance nutrition in endurance sports. Clearly, a lot more research is needed in these elite endurance athletes, so we don't have to extrapolate data from non-athlete populations. And I think that the developments in this nano biotechnology will really further enhance our understanding of the physiological and metabolic requirements of real life endurance exercise. And again, not just what we are able to measure in the lab. But clearly there's still so much more to learn. And I think it's a really, really exciting time to be involved in performance nutrition, particularly in endurance. And some of you guys might know, but following the sub 2 hour marathon, there's now a new challenge on the horizon with Alistair Brownlee and Lucy Charles Barkley aiming to do sub 7 and sub 8 hour respectively Ironman in spring 2022. And clearly nutrition is going to have a really, really big impact on enabling these athletes to achieve such feats. So I very, very much look forward to following their journeys. So thank you again to Dan for inviting me. I appreciate that was a bit of a whistle-stop overview, and there was so much more that I could have and would have loved to include, but we would have been here all day. Hopefully that's given a little bit of an insight on the history of endurance nutrition and where we're at today. So thank you very much for your time.